They say the storm doesn't take the lost, it reveals them. The blizzard had rolled in faster than the forecast promised, swallowing the narrow mountain road in a wall of white that erased distance, direction, and doubt all at once. Daniel Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his aging Ford pickup, the tires crunching cautiously over what little asphalt remained visible beneath the thickening snow. The heater rattled weakly, pushing out lukewarm air that barely reached his fingertips, but he didn't turn it up. He had learned long ago that comfort was something you carried inside, not something you dialed in. Beside him, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat of ash gray and pale cream, his ears alert, his amber eyes scanning the storm with a focus that felt almost human. They had been driving for nearly an hour through the mountains of northern Colorado, a route Daniel hadn't planned to take until the main highway closed behind him. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, just moving forward the way he had since leaving the service, 1 mile at a time, one quiet decision after another. The snow fell heavier now, thick flakes drifting sideways in the wind, tapping softly against the windshield like fingers asking to be let in. The world outside had gone silent in that peculiar way only deep winter could create, where even the engines sounded distant, as if wrapped in layers of cotton. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he leaned forward, squinting through the haze. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though Rex hadn't moved. Not yet. Then it happened. Rex's ears snapped forward, his body stiffening in an instant, a low sound building in his chest. Not quite a growl, not fear, but something older, something instinctive. Daniel felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a memory surfaces. "What is it?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but edged with attention. Rex didn't bark. Instead, he leaned forward, placing one paw against the dashboard, his gaze fixed on something beyond the swirling white. The truck rolled another 20 yards before Daniel saw it, a faint glint beneath the snowbank on the right side of the road, something metallic catching the dim gray light. He slowed, tires sliding slightly before gripping again, and brought the truck to a careful stop. The engine idled as the storm pressed in around them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rex let out 3 short, deliberate barks, the kind he only used when something mattered. Daniel exhaled slowly, pulling on his gloves. "All right," he said under his breath, opening the door. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean, stealing the warmth from his lungs as he stepped into knee-deep snow. The wind howled softly across the ridge, carrying with it the scent of ice and pine. Rex jumped down beside him, landing with practiced ease, already moving toward the spot he had seen. Together, they approached the snowbank. Daniel knelt, brushing away the powder with gloved hands until the object revealed itself, a small, weathered metal key, half buried and cold to the touch. He turned it over in his palm, frowning slightly. It didn't belong out here. Nothing did. Behind them, the wind shifted, and somewhere down the slope, a faint sound broke through the storm, a distant crunch, followed by the unmistakable echo of metal meeting ice. Daniel's head snapped up, his instincts firing before thought could catch up. Rex was already moving, ears high, body cutting through the snow toward the sound. Daniel closed his hand around the key and followed without hesitation. Sometimes, the world doesn't ask you to understand. It only asks you to act. Rex moved with a purpose that cut through the storm, his paws pressing deep into the snow but never hesitating, as if the path ahead had already been shown to him long before Daniel could see it. The wind pushed harder now, swirling in sharp gusts that blurred the edges of everything, turning the mountainside into a shifting canvas of white and gray. Daniel followed close behind, his boots sinking nearly a foot with each step, his breath steady but visible in thick clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. He kept one hand clenched around the small metal key in his pocket, feeling its weight with every stride, an object that should have meant nothing, and yet refused to feel insignificant. The sound came again, clearer this time, a strained metallic groan followed by a faint, hollow thud, the kind of sound that did not belong to wind or trees or anything natural. Rex barked once, sharp and urgent, then veered slightly to the left toward a narrow slope that dipped beneath a cluster of snow-covered pines. Daniel's pulse quickened, not from fear but from recognition, the the same quiet alertness that had guided him through darker places years ago. As they reached the edge of the slope, the scene revealed itself slowly through the storm. A sedan, dark blue beneath the frost, sat angled awkwardly against a stand of young aspens, its front end buried in a drift, its rear wheels partially lifted off the ground. Snow had already begun to claim it, soft layers building along the windows and hood, as if trying to erase it from the world. For a moment, Daniel stood still, taking it in, measuring the angles, the silence, the way the wind moved around the vehicle. Then Rex moved closer, circling once before stopping near the driver's side door, his ears forward, his body tense but controlled. Daniel approached carefully, placing each step with intention, his hand reaching out to brush away the snow from the window. Inside, two figures sat motionless, their outlines faint behind the fogged glass. An elderly man in the driver's seat, his head tilted slightly forward, and beside him, a woman wrapped in a thick wool coat, her face pale but peaceful in a way that did not feel right for the situation. Daniel tapped gently on the glass, then again, a little firmer this time. The man stirred first, his eyes opening slowly, confusion flickering across his features before awareness settled in. The woman shifted next, her hand moving weakly toward the dashboard, as if confirming where she was. Relief came quietly, not as a rush, but as a steady release of tension Daniel had not realized he was holding. "You are all right," he said through the door, his voice calm and grounded, the kind that did not invite panic. He tested the handle, but it did not budge, frozen tight. Rex stepped closer, pressing his nose against the seam of the door, then glancing back at Daniel with a look that carried both urgency and trust. Daniel nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, already moving to the rear of the car to assess another angle. The snow continued to fall, thick and steady, but something had shifted beneath it, something quieter and deeper than the storm itself. In moments like this, the world narrowed down to a single purpose, a single choice repeated again and again until it became something more than action. It became who you were. And Daniel Hayes had never learned how to walk away. Daniel moved along the rear of the vehicle, his gloved hands brushing away layers of snow until he reached the trunk, testing its handle with a firm but controlled pull, yet it held fast under a thin sheet of ice that had already sealed it in place. He stepped back, scanning the slope, the angle of the car, the way the front end had buried itself deep into the drift while the rear sat slightly elevated, leaving just enough room to work if he chose the right point of leverage. Rex stayed close to the driver's side, his body angled toward the door, ears flicking between the storm and the faint sounds coming from inside, his presence steady, grounded, as if he understood the fragile line between urgency and calm. Daniel returned to the side of the car, crouching near the door, his breath slow and measured as he pressed his palm against the frozen handle again, this time applying gradual pressure rather than force. He had learned that not everything yielded to strength. Some things required patience, the kind that listened before it acted. Inside, the elderly man shifted slightly, his eyes clearer now, watching Daniel with a quiet trust that needed no words, while the woman's hand moved again, resting lightly on the dashboard, as if drawing comfort from its familiar shape. "Stay with me," Daniel said through the glass, his voice low but steady, a rhythm more than a command. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small multi-tool, its metal cold against his fingers, and carefully worked the edge along the seam of the door, breaking the thin layer of ice that held it shut. The wind surged briefly, pushing snow against his back, but he held his position, focused on the small, deliberate movements that would make the difference. Rex shifted his stance, planting his paws firmly in the snow, his gaze fixed on Daniel, as if lending strength without needing to move. After a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, the seal gave with a soft crack, barely audible beneath the storm, and the door opened just enough for Daniel to pull it wider. A wave of cold air rushed inside, but it carried something else with it, a sense of motion returning, of stillness breaking. Daniel leaned in, his eyes quickly assessing both passengers, noting their slow movements, the way their breathing formed faint clouds in the chilled air. "We are going to take this one step at a time," he said gently, his tone unchanged, steady as the mountains around them. The man nodded faintly, his hand lifting with effort, while the woman blinked, her gaze meeting Daniel's with a quiet resilience that had not yet been worn away by the cold. Rex stepped closer, placing his head near the edge of the open door, his presence filling the space with something warm and alive, something that did not belong to the storm. Daniel reached in carefully, offering his hand to the man first, guiding him slowly, making sure each movement was supported, deliberate, nothing rushed, nothing forced. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, but it no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a witness. And somewhere in the pocket of Daniel's coat, the small metal key rested against his chest, silent but present, as if it had always been meant to arrive at this exact moment, in this exact place, waiting for hands that would not turn away. Daniel adjusted his stance in the snow, one arm steadying the elderly man as he guided him carefully out of the vehicle, each movement slow and deliberate, as if time itself had softened to match the fragile rhythm of the moment. The man's boots touched the ground with uncertainty at first, his weight shifting cautiously, but Daniel remained close, his grip firm without being forceful, allowing the older man to find his balance in his own time. Rex stepped back just enough to give them space, his eyes never leaving the pair, his ears flicking at every subtle sound, as though he were tracking not just the storm, but something deeper beneath it. The woman was next, her movements slower, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the door frame, her breath visible in thin, uneven clouds that dissolved into the wind. Daniel moved to her side, offering his arm, his voice low and steady as he reassured her without rushing a single step. "You are doing just fine," he said, not as encouragement, but as a simple truth spoken into the cold air. She nodded faintly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment, and in that glance there was something more than gratitude, something that felt like recognition, as if she had been expecting him long before the storm began. Together, they moved away from the car, each step pressing fresh tracks into the untouched snow, a quiet path forming behind them as the wind softened for a moment, as if allowing their passage. Daniel led them toward the slight incline where his truck waited above, its engine still idling, a small island of warmth in a frozen landscape. The distance was not far, perhaps 30 yards, but in the weight of the storm, it felt longer, each step carrying its own quiet challenge. Rex moved ahead, then back again, pacing in a careful pattern, his presence creating a sense of direction that words could not provide. When they reached the truck, Daniel opened the rear door, helping the man inside first, then guiding the woman gently onto the seat beside him, making sure they were both settled before closing the door against the wind. The sound of it shutting felt solid, final, like a boundary drawn between danger and safety. He circled around to the driver's side, Rex already waiting by the passenger door, snow dusting his coat, but never clinging for long. As Daniel climbed in, the warmth of the cabin met him slowly, seeping back into his hands, his shoulders, his breath. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the couple as they sat quietly, their expressions softening as the heat began to return. The man exhaled deeply, a long breath that seemed to carry more than just cold air, while the woman leaned back, her eyes closing for a brief moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. Rex settled into his seat, but his gaze shifted once more toward Daniel's coat pocket, his head tilting slightly, the same focused curiosity returning. Daniel felt it again, the presence of the small metal key resting against him, no longer just an object found in the snow, but something connected to this moment in a way he could not yet explain. He started the truck into motion, easing it forward with care, leaving the stranded car behind as the storm continued to fall around them, quieter now, almost watchful. And somewhere between the sound of the engine and the steady rhythm of falling snow, Daniel realized that this was no longer just a rescue. It was the beginning of something he had not planned, something that had already begun before he ever stepped out of the truck. The road down the mountain curved gently through the trees, barely visible beneath the fresh layer of snow that continued to fall in soft, steady silence. And Daniel kept both hands firm on the wheel, guiding the truck with careful precision as the tires found their grip inch by inch. The heater had begun to push out real warmth now, filling the cabin with a quiet comfort that contrasted sharply with the cold they had just left behind. And in the rearview mirror, he could see the colors slowly returning to the faces of the elderly couple. The man sat upright, his shoulders still tense but no longer rigid, while the woman rested back against the seat, her eyes open now, watching the passing trees as if they carried memories she had not expected to see again. Rex shifted slightly in his seat, his body relaxed but his attention still present, his ears flicking occasionally toward the back, listening not just for sound but for something deeper, something that moved beneath words. After a few minutes, the man cleared his throat, the sound quiet but steady, as if reclaiming his voice one breath at a time. "I thought that was it," he said softly, his gaze lowering for a moment before lifting again. Daniel did not respond immediately, giving the words space to settle, the way he had learned to do in moments that carried more weight than they first revealed. "Storms have a way of making things feel final," he said at last, his tone even, not dismissing the fear, but not holding on to it either. The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes moving from the window to Daniel, then to Rex, and something in her expression shifted, a quiet recognition that seemed to reach beyond the present moment. "You found something before you found us," she said, her voice gentle but certain. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened just enough to notice, and for a brief second, he considered dismissing it, letting it pass as coincidence or confusion brought on by the cold, but something about the way she said it made that impossible. Rex turned his head toward her, his gaze steady, as if confirming what she already knew. Daniel reached into his coat pocket without taking his eyes off the road, his fingers closing around the small metal key before bringing it into view. The metal caught the faint glow of the dashboard lights, its surface worn smooth by time, its shape simple but deliberate. The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied it, and then he exhaled slowly, a sound that carried both surprise and something deeper, something like disbelief softened by understanding. The woman's hand rose instinctively, hovering just short of the key, as if touching it too quickly might break whatever fragile connection held the moment together. "We lost that," she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the engine. 40 years ago. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment, even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if listening. Daniel glanced at her in the mirror, his expression unchanged, but his thoughts shifting in ways he could not fully trace. "Out there?" he asked simply, not questioning her, just trying to understand the path that had brought the key into his hand. The man nodded slowly. "There is a place," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "A cabin beyond the ridge. It belonged to my father. We have not been there in decades." Rex let out a soft breath, settling deeper into his seat, but his eyes remained bright, alert, as if the story unfolding around them was something he had already begun to follow long before the first word was spoken. And as the truck continued down the mountain, the snow falling softer now, Daniel felt the weight of the key shift in his hand, no longer just cold metal, but something waiting to be understood, something that had not been lost at all, only delayed until the right moment, the right storm, and the right hands came together. The truck rolled into the edge of a small mountain town just as the storm began to loosen its grip, the snowfall thinning into a quiet drift that softened rooftops, street signs, and the long stretch of road ahead, and Daniel guided the vehicle toward a modest clinic with a single glowing light in the front window, its warmth visible even from a distance. He parked near the entrance, the engine settling into a low hum before he turned it off, allowing the silence to return in a gentler form than before. Rex stepped out first, shaking the snow from his coat, then stood by the door as Daniel helped the elderly man and woman carefully from the back seat, supporting them one at a time as their legs adjusted to solid ground again. Inside, the clinic was quiet, the air warm with the faint scent of antiseptic and old wood, and a nurse greeted them with calm efficiency, guiding the couple toward a pair of chairs near a small heater while offering blankets that seemed to carry more comfort than their simple fabric suggested. Daniel remained nearby, his posture relaxed but attentive, watching as the couple settled, their movements slower now but steady, their breathing even. Rex lay down near the door, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained open, tracking the room with a quiet awareness that never fully faded. After a short while, a doctor appeared, speaking softly with the couple, checking their hands, their breathing, their pulse, confirming what Daniel had already sensed, that they would be all right. The man nodded through the conversation, while the woman listened with a distant calm, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. When the doctor stepped away, she turned her gaze back to Daniel. Her eyes clearer now, carrying a depth that had nothing to do with the storm. "That cabin," she said gently, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. "It is not just a place. It holds something we were meant to protect." Daniel did not interrupt, allowing her words to form at their own pace. The way he had learned mattered most. The man leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if anchoring himself to the present. "My father built it after the war," he added. "He said some things are not meant to be found by everyone, only by the ones who listen." Rex lifted his head at that, his ears turning toward them, as if the word listen carried a meaning beyond sound. Daniel reached into his coat again, placing the small metal key on the table beside them, its presence quiet but undeniable. The woman looked at it for a long moment before gently picking it up, her fingers tracing its edges as if reacquainting herself with a memory she had carried for decades. "We searched for this," she said softly. "We thought it was gone forever." The man exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching his face for the first time. "Maybe it was not lost," he said. "Maybe it was waiting." The room seemed to settle around those words, the quiet stretching just enough to let them take root. Daniel felt something shift within him, not a realization, not yet, but the beginning of one, the sense that the path he had been walking without direction had just found a purpose he had not been looking for. Outside, the storm continued to fade, leaving behind a stillness that felt less like an ending and more like a pause, the kind that comes before something begins. Rex rose to his feet, stepping closer to Daniel, his shoulder brushing lightly against his leg, grounding him in the present moment. And as Daniel looked from the key to the couple, and then back toward the quiet world beyond the window, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever waited at that cabin had not been meant for just anyone. It had been meant for someone who would stop, who would listen, and who would not turn away when the storm called. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet that only follows a storm. The sky stretched wide and pale above the mountain town, the air crisp and still as if the world had been gently reset overnight. And Daniel stood just outside the clinic, his breath rising in soft clouds as he watched the early light settle over the snow-covered rooftops. Rex stood beside him, calm but alert, his gaze shifting occasionally toward the road that led back into the mountains, as though he already knew where they would be going next. Inside, the elderly couple had rested through the night, their strength returning in small, steady ways, and when they stepped outside to meet him, there was something different in their posture, a quiet certainty that had not been there before. The man carried himself with renewed steadiness, while the woman held the small metal key carefully in her gloved hand, her fingers wrapped around it, as if it were both fragile and essential. "We should go today," she said, her voice calm but firm, her eyes meeting Daniel's without hesitation. "The road will hold, and the place has waited long enough." Daniel studied her for a moment, not questioning the decision, but measuring the weight behind it, the sense that this was not simply a choice, but a continuation of something already set in motion. He nodded once, a simple agreement that required no further explanation. The drive back toward the ridge felt different in the daylight, the path clearer now, the snow reflecting the morning sun in soft, blinding waves that stretched across the landscape like a quiet sea. Daniel guided the truck carefully along the narrow road, the tires pressing fresh tracks into the untouched surface, while the man in the back seat offered occasional directions, his voice steady, guiding them toward a place that seemed to exist just beyond memory. Rex remained focused, his posture upright, his ears shifting with each subtle change in the surroundings, as if he were listening not just to the road, but to something beneath it. After nearly 40 minutes, the man leaned forward slightly. "There," he said, pointing toward a narrow path that broke away from the main road, barely visible beneath the snow, winding between a cluster of tall pines that stood like silent guardians. Daniel slowed the truck, turning carefully onto the path, the branches overhead filtering the light into soft patterns that moved across the windshield like shifting shadows. The air felt different here, quieter, heavier in a way that did not feel threatening, but intentional. They followed the path for another quarter-mile before the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it stood. The cabin, weathered wood, aged but intact, its structure simple yet solid, as if it had been built not just to endure the elements, but to outlast time itself. Snow rested along its roof and windowsills, untouched, undisturbed, as though no one had approached it in years. Daniel brought the truck to a slow stop, the engine falling silent as the moment settled around them. No one spoke at first. The woman stepped out, her boots pressing into the snow as she moved forward, her gaze fixed on the cabin with a quiet intensity that carried both memory and purpose. The man followed, slower but steady, his breath measured as he took in the sight. Rex stepped down last, his paws silent against the snow as he moved ahead of them, stopping just short of the cabin door, his body still, his head slightly tilted, listening. Daniel reached into his coat, feeling the absence of the key now, knowing it was no longer his to carry, and as he walked toward the door, he understood that whatever waited beyond it had already begun to change the path he thought he was on. Some places do not call out loudly. They wait, and when the right moment comes, they open. The woman stepped up to the cabin door and paused, her gloved hand hovering just inches from the weathered wood, as if she could feel something through it, something that had been waiting longer than memory could hold. And for a moment the air itself seemed to grow still, the kind of stillness that does not belong to silence, but to presence. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, his breath slow, his eyes tracing the lines of the structure, the grain of the wood worn smooth in places where hands had once rested, the faint marks of time layered like quiet stories no one had spoken aloud in years. Rex remained near the threshold, his body steady, ears forward, his gaze fixed on the door as though he were listening to something just beyond it, something not yet revealed but already understood. The man approached slowly, his steps measured, his eyes never leaving the key in the woman's hand, and when he reached her side, he placed his hand gently over hers, not guiding, not urging, just present. "It has been a long time," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years that had passed without return. The woman nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the key before she lifted it, aligning it with the old lock that sat beneath a thin layer of frost. For a brief second, nothing happened, and then with a quiet turn, the lock gave way, the sound soft but certain, like a door opening not just to a room, but to something held in trust. She pushed the door inward slowly, and the cabin revealed itself in a dim wash of natural light that filtered through the frosted windows, illuminating a space untouched by time. The air inside was cool but still, carrying the faint scent of aged wood and something older, something almost like memory itself. Daniel stepped inside after them, his boots sounding softly against the wooden floor, his eyes adjusting to the gentle shadows that filled the room. Everything was as it had been left, a table near the window, a stone fireplace along the far wall, shelves lined with objects that seemed ordinary at first glance, but held a quiet significance that could not be easily named. Rex moved ahead, his steps careful, his nose lowering slightly as he followed a path invisible to the others, stopping near the far corner where the floorboards met in a subtle, uneven line. He stood there, still, then looked back at Daniel, his gaze steady, waiting. Daniel felt it again, that same quiet pull he had felt on the road, not a command, not even a thought, but something that asked to be followed. He walked toward the spot, kneeling slowly, his hand brushing across the wood until he felt it, the faint edge of a seam hidden beneath the surface. The man exhaled sharply behind him, recognition settling into his expression as he stepped closer. "My father always said the cabin would speak," he murmured, almost to himself. Daniel pressed gently, and with a slight shift, a section of the floor lifted, revealing a narrow compartment beneath. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth that had aged but not decayed, were documents, small metal boxes, and items that carried the unmistakable weight of something preserved with intention. The woman stepped forward, her hand covering her mouth for a brief moment, not in shock, but in something quieter, something like relief. "We thought it was gone," she whispered. The man shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the hidden space. "No," he said softly. "It was waiting." The light from the window shifted slightly as the clouds moved outside, casting a gentle glow over the open compartment, and in that moment, the cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt complete, and Daniel, still kneeling there, understood that what they had found was not just something valuable. It was something entrusted, something that had chosen its moment, its storm, and the hands that would uncover it when the time was right. The woman knelt slowly beside the open compartment, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of memory returning all at once. And she carefully lifted one of the wrapped bundles, unfolding the cloth with a reverence that made even the smallest movement feel significant. Inside were documents aged to a soft yellow, edges worn but preserved with care, along with a small metal box that reflected the faint light from the window in quiet, muted tones. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the contents, recognition settling deeper with each passing second, and for a moment he said nothing, as if words would only diminish what was being understood. Daniel remained where he was, giving them space, his gaze steady but respectful, aware that this moment belonged to them, not to him, even though he had been led here as surely as they had. Rex stood nearby, his posture relaxed now, his tail still, his attention calm, as if the purpose that had driven him through the storm had reached its natural end. The woman opened the small metal box, her breath catching softly as she revealed what lay inside. A collection of carefully kept items, letters, photographs, and a folded paper that seemed to hold a different kind of weight, something deliberate, something final. The man reached for it slowly, unfolding it with steady hands, his eyes moving across the lines in silence before he exhaled deeply, a sound that carried both release and understanding. He knew, he said quietly, his voice filled with a calm certainty. My father knew this day would come. The woman looked up at Daniel then, her eyes clear, no longer clouded by the past, but grounded in the present, and she extended the paper toward him. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of respect, before accepting it, his fingers brushing the worn edges as he read. It was a document, simple in form but profound in meaning, a transfer of ownership, not just of the cabin, but of everything it held, entrusted forward not to blood alone, but to character, to the one who would arrive not by intention, but by action. Daniel lowered the paper slowly, his expression unchanged, but something within him settling into place, something that had been searching without direction now finding its ground. This is yours, the man said, his voice steady, not offering, but affirming. Daniel looked from the paper to the couple, then to the quiet space around them, the cabin, the hidden compartment, the light that had shifted just enough to illuminate the room fully. And he understood that this was not a reward in the way the world often defined it. It was a responsibility, a continuation, something that asked not to be owned, but to be carried forward. Rex stepped closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him in the moment, and Daniel rested his hand briefly on the dog's head, a silent acknowledgement of the path they had walked together. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, no longer harsh, no longer demanding, just present, like a quiet reminder that storms do not last, but what they reveal can remain. Daniel folded the paper carefully, placing it back into the metal box before handing it to the man, his decision made without words. The man smiled faintly, understanding without needing explanation, and placed the box back within the compartment before closing it gently. Some things, it seemed, were not meant to change hands immediately, but to be honored first, understood before accepted. As they stood together in the stillness of the cabin, the past and present no longer felt separate, and Daniel realized that he had not been given something to take away. He had been given a place to belong, something earned not through seeking, but through choosing to stay when it mattered most. And as he stepped back toward the doorway, Rex beside him, the light outside stretching across the snow in quiet reflection, it became clear that sometimes the greatest gift is not what is found, but who you become when you are willing to listen.